Hey, what's up guys? Matt here coming to you from Laidlaw's Harley-Davidson. So today we're going to be tackling kind of a fun topic. Harley-Davidson this year in 2024 is celebrating 40 years of Softail goodness. So basically 40 years since the first Softail was shipped from the factory. And so we're going to be diving into a little bit of the history of the Softail that came about in 1984. The first Softail being the FXST, the Softail standard. And basically the genesis of the Softail, why it came to be, what was it and what still is the appeal of a Softail? Why did Harley-Davidson make it? And why has this style really withstood the test of time and really influenced a lot of different motorcycles over the years, not just Harleys, but a bunch of different cruiser motorcycles over the years. And then after a history, I'm going to jump into what I believe to be the top 10 Softails of all time. So I'm going to be counting those down, starting from number 10 and then going all the way up to number 1, what I feel like is the best all-around Softail Harley-Davidson has ever produced. And giving you guys a little bit of a brief history on each of those bikes and why I chose them for the different ranking positions that I chose them for. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of criteria that I judge these bikes off of, things like longevity in the Softail lineup, popularity, influence in Harley-Davidson's lineup, respect to the history and the lineage of the Softail lineup, and just how good the bike was overall mechanically and just how many riders' needs it suited. And so there's just a lot of things that I'm going to consider when I rank these bikes. And always, guys, I can't talk about the best without talking about the worst. And so I'm going to be sprinkling in the top 3 worst Softails as well. So let's jump right into the history of Softail real quick, and then I'm going to jump into my top 10 best and top 3 worst. So now let's talk real quick, guys, about how this frame came to be and really why it came to be. And I love this story because it's a perfect example of really what Harley-Davidson tries to accomplish, and that is give you the classic appeal of an American motorcycle, but incorporate new modern technology into that motorcycle so that it runs good, that the suspension's decent, and that it's actually enjoyable to ride, but you still have that classic appeal, which I think kind of that mantra is infused into most of the Harley-Davidsons we see today. And so this is a perfect example in Harley-Davidson's history where we saw that in a big way. So it's interesting, let's go back to like the 70s real quick. So in the 70s, that's when AMF owned Harley-Davidson Motor Company. Many refer to it as the dark ages of Harley-Davidson. But coming out of that, a lot of the executives at the motor company, there's like 13 of them, bought back the Harley-Davidson Motor Company from AMF in 1981. One of those guys was the GOAT, Willie G. Davidson, a living legend. We just celebrated him at the homecoming celebration this year in Milwaukee. This is another example why Willie G is the GOAT. When they bought back the company, they were really making a lot of big moves to make their motorcycles as good as they possibly could. And I talk a lot about the FXR frame on this channel that came about in, what was it, 82. But very few people talk about the Softail chassis, which is just as much, if not more important than the FXR. And that frame came about in 1984. So what the execs did, most notably Willie G, he sought out a guy named Bill Davis who had already started making his own Softail frame, and then he commissioned an engineering firm that Harley-Davidson had worked with for a long time, who was head up by a guy named Jim Hubert, to also start making a Softail design as well. And really what the premise was, guys, is they wanted something that looked like a hardtail but didn't ride like a hardtail. I mean, it's just a spine-breaking experience for those of you who have ever ridden a hardtail before. So they wanted something that had that clean, shockless look in the tail end with that triangular swing arm that had suspension. Ultimately, it ended up being underneath the bike because so many guys still preferred hardtails. So after World War II, a lot of guys were riding the WLA, like the Army surplus bikes, and they were making choppers out of them and everything, which is kind of like the beginning of how the choppers came to be. That's a whole different story. But even after that, like in the 70s, when there were bikes that had suspension on them, like the FLs with the Duo Glide, and bikes like the Wide Glide and the Super Glide, these were motorcycles that had suspension on them. But Willie G was taking note that a lot of guys still preferred the hardtails and would prefer to ride a harsher riding bike just so they could have that uncluttered, clean tail end of a hardtail motorcycle. So what happened? So there was a guy named Bill Davis who was a big time Harley-Davidson enthusiast, and in the mid 70s he was working on a design that was basically a Softail design, and he was using a Harley-Davidson Super Glide to mock up with his new Softail design, and he patented his design. And Willie G. Davidson actually visited with Mike Davis in 1976, and he was super impressed with the design. He said, yeah, we'll talk. And then in 1980, Harley-Davidson also also went to an engineering firm that was head up by a Jim Hubert, and they basically commissioned him to do the same thing, make a Softail design so that in the future they could launch this new Softail frame. And in the 70s, it was kind of a long-term project with really no finish in sight. So Harley-Davidson never really got back to Bill Davis. He found an investor and they tried to market their new Softail frame and sell it independently under the company name of Roadworks Subshock. But the business and everything kind of collapsed, and that never really worked out. And then, like I mentioned, the buyback happened, and then all of a sudden things got real. And then shortly after that, Jeffrey Bluestein, one of the Harley-Davidson executives, contacted Bill Davis and said, hey, you still got that Softail design, we want to buy it from you. So in 1982, Harley-Davidson Motor Company bought the prototypes, the tooling, and basically the rights to Bill Davis's Softail. And then from 1982, when they acquired the tooling and prototypes and everything of that Softail, they perfected it and worked out the kinks for about a year, and then they produced the 1984 Softail standard for the first time. It actually shipped in 1983, but as an 84 model year Softail, and this is what launched the Softail frame in Harley-Davidson's lineup. And we basically had that design all the way through the 2017 model year, and then in the 2018 model year, as many of you guys know, they completely redid the Softail chassis. They gobbled up the Dyna lineup as well, which is one of the most controversial moments in Harley-Davidson's history. I'm actually going to be doing a video on the death of the Dyna, so stay tuned for that video in the future, but that's another topic for another time. But from that point on, basically Harley-Davidson had their Softail frame. You've got these dual shocks that are mounted horizontally underneath the gearbox between the two tubes that run horizontally with the road. And these twin shocks that run parallel with the ground are kind of unique because the shock absorption actually happens when the shocks are extended as opposed to being compressed. So as you hit a bump and the rider's seat goes down, the shocks actually extend out, and that's where the dampening or the shock absorption actually happens. So with this new frame in place, all Harley-Davidson had to do was slap their new 80 cubic inch Evo into there, which was their new motor they launched in the early 80s. There were some bikes shipped with a shovel head in this Softail frame, but there was only overlap for about 1 year. And from here, guys, on this new Softail frame, the sky was the limit. Harley-Davidson could reproduce a ton of bikes from its past, and that's exactly what they did. So let's jump into my personal top 10 Softails of all time. And as I go through these bikes, I'll be sprinkling tidbits of why it was appropriate for Harley-Davidson to put these various bikes on the Softail chassis. Because as I'll explain, a lot of these motorcycles gained a lot of inspiration from the early days of Harley-Davidson and are kind of a reincarnation of some of Harley-Davidson's oldest, most classic looking motorcycles. Alright guys, so let's jump right into it. So I'm going to start off at number 10 with the Softail Slim. Now the Slim, it was a very cool bike. It didn't have a long history in the Softail family. It didn't come out until 2012, but when it came out, it was a heavy hitter. A lot of people liked it. It was really cool because it took styling cues from the post-World War II era. So basically the late 40s, early 50s. It took some styling cues from like the WLAs that were left over after World War II, the kind of bike that I mentioned earlier. So you've got the half moon shaped floorboards, which are definitely a cool era nod to that post World War II look. They've got the Hollywood bar. The Hollywood bar has that little cross strengthening member across the handlebars there. That's another piece that was very indicative of the post World War II era. They called it the Hollywood bar because a lot of the guys would put bags up there and charms and lights and just all kinds of stuff on that bar. And when you did that, it was said that you had gone Hollywood by putting a bunch of accessories and doodads and storage bags and things like that on the Hollywood bar. The Slim was so popular that the Harley-Davidson actually made an S version of the Slim after the original Slim came out. And what's kind of cool too, they had two paint schemes on the Slim S. One was all black, and then one of them was like this olive denim green with this army star on the side of the tank. So it was directly painted to resemble one of those World War II army bikes, which I think took that style even a step further. Those Slim S's with the 110 cubic inch twin cam with the star on the tank are really cool bikes. A lot of guys took it a step further and outfitted them with like ammo cans for saddlebags and like little military bags. I think I saw one with like a rifle holder or something like that. The bike also made an appearance in Captain America, where Captain America himself was riding the Softail Slim around. In the 2018 Softail frame change, they brought the Slim out on this new Softail chassis as well. Continued to be a very simple, very basic bike. You had a ribbed solo seat on it, a single 7-inch headlamp, the half moon floorboards, no passenger seat. One of the big things about its name is it had a slim rear tire. It almost looked like a Fat Boy until you saw the tail end, and it was only like a 130 millimeter rear tire on it or something like that. Hence the name Slim. I think that was also a really popular nickname back during like the 50s as well. So clever name. Definitely a cool era of Harley-Davidson's history to bring out a bike to pay homage to or to recreate a classic looking Harley-Davidson. Perfect choice for the Softail platform. The bike was discontinued in 2021. I think the demand for that model just kind of ran its course and Harley-Davidson subbed it out for other options. Alright guys, so we're going to get salty here real quick in this video. So I'm going to start off here with the number 3 worst Softail of all time. And again guys, this is just my opinion. I don't mean this to be offensive to anybody that may own this bike. In fact, pretty much all the worst Softails, they actually have some really good redeeming, cool attributes about them as well. But in my opinion, they just made some big mistakes, or maybe they were just terrible sellers and nobody wanted them, which is part of the criteria as to how I chose these worst bikes. But nonetheless, the first one I'm going to be picking here is the Sport Glide, and more specifically, the 2019 Sport Glide. So there are some things that this bike did really well. I'm going to point those out actually, and this bike actually is pretty meaningful to the Laidlaw's Harley-Davidson history. So the Sport Glide was rad because it was just an all-around really good bike. It was the second year of the new Softail frame change, which every time I jumped on one of those bikes when that frame first came out, I was just like in awe. Now I'm just a little bit desensitized to how good the new Softails are. But when the 2018 Softail frame change happened, if you rode the old Softail back to back with the new Softail, it was like, oh my gosh, these new Softails are just light years better. Anyway, so it was the second year of that. Harley-Davidson introduced a set of new hard saddlebags that were detachable on this model, which I think these bags have become a real big hit with a lot of people, in spite of the fact that on the right hand side it's a little bit shallower than the left hand side. That was done to accommodate for the exhaust, but a lot of people complained about that. And it was just a good all-around riding motorcycle. The suspension was great. You had an inverted front end. The seat was really comfortable as well. This bike was the bike that we built our Coast Glide on when we entered into the Battle of the Kings in 2019. And for those of you who've been watching my channel for a really long time, know that that was a really big highlight in Laidlaw's Harley-Davidson history when we won the global champion for the Battle of the Kings, and we built that bike on a Sport Glide. So the Sport Glide is a very meaningful bike to me, but now I'm going to start to get real sour. So in my opinion, the Sport Glide was a huge missed opportunity. And that's part of the reason why we made it our Battle of the Kings bike of choice, is we liked the saddlebags a lot. The fact that it had the name Sport Glide, which is an iconic name in the Harley-Davidson world that was made famous by the FXRT Sport Glide that came out in 1983. So right there you have a lot to live up to, which the Sport Glide didn't, unfortunately. I'll get to that in a second. But really the biggest failure on this bike, guys, was the fairing. I don't know who designed this thing. I don't know who signed off on it. But to put the fairing that they did on this Sport Glide was an absolute insult to the Harley-Davidson community. An absolute slap in the face. Yeah, it's detachable and all that stuff, great. But this stupid little fairing they put on the Sport Glide, I mean, at least call it something else. You defiled that name. You basically took a piss on the grave of the 1984 FXRT, and I'm not okay with that. This rubbed our dealership so wrong that that's part of the reason why we decided to take it, make a real Sport Glide the right way that it should have been done. And who would have thought we ended up winning the entire world championship with our Coast Glide, as we called it. I'll also say the wheels on this bike just do not fit this at all. They called it the Mantis wheel. It probably would have been decent on a different bike, but these wheels are just so out of place in terms of the lineage of the Sport Glide. Here's the other thing that bothers me, guys. Harley-Davidson, they definitely reconciled this whole travesty when they came out with the Lowrider ST. But the thing that sucks is I think the Lowrider ST should be called the Sport Glide. It's like Harley-Davidson wasted the good name on this bike.
We We wasted the good surprise on you.
So that just doesn't sit real well with me because I see the Lowrider ST as a really long-term bike that's going to stay in the lineup for a very long time because it's just crazy popular since it came out in the 22 model year, which by the way, in the 22 model year, when the Lowrider ST came out, in North America, the Sport Glide went away. You can still get the Sport Glide in other markets around the world, like Europe and Australia and places like that. But that pretty much sums it up, guys. Bad fairing design, bad wheel design. They took the good name. Now when I explain the history of Harley-Davidson to my son, I'm going to have to explain how Harley-Davidson messed up the first time on the Sport Glide, and that's why the Lowrider ST basically lost its name to a bike where they messed up on the fairing. And Lowrider ST isn't a bad name per se. In fact, it's a good name. I'm a Harley-Davidson purist. I respect the past, and the fairing on the Lowrider ST was inspired by the FXRT, and so it just would have made a lot more sense in Harley-Davidson's lineage if the Lowrider ST was called the Sport Glide instead. And so that's just something that's just probably always going to bother me. And for these reasons, guys, I'm going to have to give the Softail Sport Glide that was produced in North America from 2019 to 2021 the number 3 worst Softail Harley-Davidson has ever created. Alright guys, so for this next bike, I really struggled as to whether or not I should include it on Harley-Davidson's top 10 Softails of all time, mostly because it comes from the wrong bloodline, and I felt very wrong about including this bike on a Softail lineup to celebrate 40 years of Softail, when really the bloodlines are wrong for this bike. It cannot trace its roots back to the original Softails. But I decided to make an exception because it is such a good Softail. So without further ado, I'm going to go number 9 best Softails of all time. I'm going to give it to the Lowrider ST. And yes, I did time the bad one with the good one right next to each other because I just got done talking about the Lowrider ST and how it was kind of the redemption bike from the Sport Glide. But here's why I decided to break my own rule about the roots of this bike and not including it, because guys, as many of you guys know, I'm a purist, and as a purist I know that the Lowrider can only be identified as either an FXR or a Dyna. Guys, in my book, a Lowrider will always be from one of those two families, and it won't really ever be from the Softail family. So the name of this bike is the Lowrider ST. It was directly modeled after the FXRT, as I just mentioned. And so this bike was adopted into the Softail family. It does not have direct bloodlines with a Softail. And that's part of the reason why I ranked it so low on this list. And really, I probably wouldn't have included it on this list at all if it wasn't such a good bike. And here's the deal, the name Lowrider ST has never been used before, and it was first introduced on this new Softail chassis. And so I decided to make an exception here, which is kind of the same exception I made for my number 3 worst bike on the Sport Glide. But I think at the end of the day, guys, we all know the Lowrider ST has been a Grand Slam knockout, extremely popular bike since it was first introduced in the 22 model year. We have not been able to keep this bike in stock for like the first 2 years, the 22 and 23 model year. Now we're in the 24th model year, the 3rd year that this bike has been in production, and we're finally seeing bikes on the floor where you can come in and just buy one off the floor. This bike just does everything right. You got a 117 motor, you got Harley-Davidson's Softail chassis, which is awesome. You've got these bags that were first introduced on the Sport Glide, like I mentioned. You have Harley-Davidson's modern rendition of the FXRT fairing, which I think came out awesome. Harley-Davidson made an icon bike off of this called the El Diablo, which again was a throwback modern version of the FXRT, which I thought was awesome. The El Diablo has been by far the most popular icon bike we've seen thus far. It's just a good all-around bike. It's a midweight cruiser, so around a 700-pound bike. The power to weight ratio is awesome. I just can't say enough good things about the Lowrider ST. It's a Grand Slam bike, but it ranks number 9 in my opinion on Softails because once again, it's got the wrong blood. It's not from the right family. And I respect Harley-Davidson's history, and so the higher ranking positions I'm always going to give to the real Softails. Alright guys, so next up on the list, coming in at number 8 best Softail of all time, I'm going to have to give it to the Softail Deuce. The Softail Deuce first came in the 2000 model year, and that's kind of a period of time when Harley-Davidsons were just really hot and flying off the shelves. And the Softail Deuce really resembles like a Softail Custom. So you've got a rear wheel, solid mag wheel, then you got a big 21-inch spoke wheel in the front, narrow. It's an FX front end. So the model designation FX for the front end, ST for Softail, and then D for Deuce. FXSTD what's cool about the Deuce is there are a lot of unique bespoke parts to this bike. For example, the gas tank. The gas tank was like this narrow, long fuel tank that was different from all the other bikes. 5-gallon fuel tank, I believe. The rear fender had this cool like tail light that was kind of embedded into the rear fender. It looked very custom. And you had kind of that chopped front fender. You had a pullback riser that pulled the bars back with a very low rise bar on there. And then you also had forward controls on the Deuce, so your feet out in front of you. It was right there at the beginning of the Twin Cam 88 era. I believe the Twin Cam 88 first came on the Softails in the 2000 model year. I know it was 99 for the touring bikes, but the Softail Deuce ran for a solid 8 years consecutively. The last year the Deuce was 2007, and I think some of the appeal that made the Deuce special initially kind of faded over time, which is why they discontinued it. I think a lot of the appeal was that it was just a very cool factory custom motorcycle that had unique parts. That style of bike, like a Softail with chopped fenders, and it had the 34-degree front rake on there, so it was the most radical factory rake at the time as well. It had some of the DNA of like a chopper build kind of. My dad, Jerry, always talks about the Deuce being one of the most popular bikes back in the early 2000s. The demand for these was just through the roof, which definitely plays a factor in me including it on this list here. But that's it, guys. Solid number 8 at the Softail Deuce, the FXSTD. 8-year history. Just a great bike that a lot of Harley riders in the early 2000s will always remember. Alright guys, before we move on to the 7th best Softail of all time, I'm going to go ahead and insert another bad one here. So I'm going to be talking about now the 2nd worst Softail of all time in my opinion. And I give that award to the Rocker and the Rocker C. So in 2008, Harley-Davidson really wanted to jump on the chopper craze bandwagon. During the early 2000s, the economy was bumping. You had guys like Jesse James out of Long Beach making these $75,000, $100,000 custom choppers. You had the Tuttles at Orange County Choppers making these super over-the-top, extravagant, expensive choppers. Anybody with a bunch of money was buying a bike from one of these two builders. They had shows on the Discovery Channel, and Harley-Davidson was like, hey, we want a piece of that too. And so in Harley-Davidson's attempts to make a factory chopper, of course, Harley-Davidson's factory chopper, the Rocker in this case, could actually ride it. The ergonomics were decent, and it was a somewhat practical bike, unlike Jesse James bikes, and especially unlike Orange County Choppers bikes. And those bikes were more of like an advertising marketing piece that you could do to get your name on the Discovery Channel, basically. But they were really cool and radical, so props to those guys. I mean, they did make beautiful bikes for the intended purpose. But the Rocker, it was very gimmicky too, which is kind of funny. So it came to you in like this chopper-esque bike. You had this big fat rear tire. The first thing that was very unique about this is they really went for that hardtail look where the fender was just barely hovering over the rear tire. And they were able to do that because they attached the rear fender to the swing arm, so the fender went up and down with the wheel. And so they were able to accomplish that hardtail fender just above the wheel look. And then the big time gimmick on this bike was it came with what looked like just a solo saddle. Oh, but wait, if you wanted to, you could flip up the rider's seat to uncover a large passenger seat bracket. You flip that out, and then you slide out the passenger pad, slap that on, and you've got a passenger seat just in case you meet someone at the local bar or whatever that night. You're able to go 2 up in a pinch, and if you wanted to convert it back to just a solo saddle, you were able to do that by tucking the passenger seat back underneath the rider seat and not compromise that cool, sleek chopper styling. The bike also had cool, unique bars to them. It had a raked out front end, big 19-inch mag wheel in the front. So where did we go wrong? Well, first of all, no one really liked it that much. It sold okay in 2008 when it first came out, but not great. And after that, it was kind of this bike that the style just didn't really hit for most people. And I think the biggest flaw was because of that fender attached to the swing arm look, you had this seat that just looked like it was kind of hovering over thin air. And the passenger seat was definitely hovering over thin air as well. And so I think the styling just kind of missed the mark. The bike actually did kind of handle bad as well. So this bike in my eyes will always be one of those bikes that Harley-Davidson really was thinking outside of the box, wanted to try something kind of radical and new that never never been done before. Unfortunately, it was kind of a failed attempt. And the Rocker and Rocker C, the difference between those bikes, of course, the Rocker C was a little bit fancier with more chrome finishes and everything. It was a little bit more expensive. The regular Rocker had a little bit more of the dull finishes. You were able to save a little bit of costs on the MSRP. They both ran through the 2011 model year and were discontinued in 2012. So unfortunately, Harley-Davidson took a chance. They tried to capitalize on a hot market. The other thing that kind of sucked is the bike didn't come out till 2008, which is kind of when the economy started to take a dump. And so they missed out on the whole gravy train chopper craze. And so for that reason, the styling never really caught on, bad sales, kind of a gimmick that didn't really work out. The Rocker and Rocker C definitely get my number 2 spot for the worst Softails ever made. Alright, so coming up next, ranked number 7 on my all-time best Softails list would have to be the Softail Breakout. And the Breakout has been a great bike. It's definitely been a very successful bike. And this bike was kind of the redemption bike for the Rocker C. You guys starting to see a pattern in this video here. So after Harley-Davidson's failed attempt at really targeting that chopper craze with the Rocker C, Harley-Davidson tried again, and this time they nailed it with the Breakout. So once again, the Breakout featured a 240mm rear tire, 34-degree rake angle in the front with a big 21-inch wheel, very long, lean, low slung profile and stance, much like most choppers are. The Breakout was first introduced in the 2013 model year, and it was first introduced as a CVO actually, which was very unique because I've never seen Harley-Davidson first introduce a brand new model on a CVO first. But it was kind of appropriate for this bike because, as many of you guys are aware, CVOs are very well known for their finishes, their fancy over-the-top paint, which is kind of synonymous with choppers. So it was very appropriate to make a CVO version of the Breakout to first introduce this model. And then halfway through the 2013 model year, Harley-Davidson made a OE Breakout, so a non-CVO Breakout. And immediately this bike was a hit. I want to say about 5 years later, they made the Pro Street Breakout, which was like more of a performance-driven version of the CVO Breakout. This Breakout had like inverted front end, dual disc brakes, a little bit smaller front wheel, so just a little bit more of a performance vibe from the Pro Street Breakout. And then in the 2018 model year, when they revamped the Softail frame, the Breakout was one of the Softails that got re-debuted on this new Softail frame. Of course, they made some changes to it. They went to a 3.5 gallon tank, which I really liked, by the way. Any chopper builder knows that in most cases, less is more. So to have a smaller little tank up there where you can see more of the top of the engine, I think took the chopper styling one step further, which I appreciated personally. Of course, a lot of people complained, and Harley-Davidson discontinued the Breakout in North America in the 21 and 22 model year. And then when they re-debuted it in the 2023 model year, they came back out with a 5 gallon fuel tank. But all in all, guys, the Breakout is now Harley-Davidson's factory chopper bike that goes for that chopper styling. Fat tire in the rear, long raked out front end, big wheel in the front, minimalist, no frill styling, usually has nicer paint, nicer finishes, and the Breakout's pretty much a popular bike every single year. So the Breakout sits real pretty, and it was an easy decision for me at number 7. Alright guys, so next up on the list at number 6 of top Softails of all time, I gotta give it to the Softail Standard. And I'm also gonna lump in the Softail Custom in there as well, just because they're so closely related. But I gotta throw it up for the Softail that started it all in 1984 with the FXST, the Softail Standard. It's very hard to beat the OG bike of anything. And this is also a bike that's come in and out of the lineup for all 40 of those years that the Softail has been in existence, and it's always just kind of a contender in the lineup, especially in the early years. So in the 80s and the 90s, the FXST was typically your price point bike, or if you wanted just a simple get on the road, best value for your buck type of a bike that had all the right elements of a Harley-Davidson, and the Softail Standard was typically the bike you wanted to go for. Later on, and I'm mostly familiar with the Softail Custom in the early 2000s, the FXSTC, it had the core identifiable traits of the solid mag wheel in the rear, usually a little bit fatter, usually about a 180mm. I think sometimes it was a 200mm in the tail end in the early 2000s, and you typically always saw that big 21-inch laced wheel in the front. Of course, now I want to say in the 2020 model year, we have the Softail Standard, the FXST, which personally I don't like. If anything, I feel like this bike takes away a little bit from the original FXST, because quite frankly, the new modern FXST is just kind kind of a neutered down street bob. You really don't have the core elements of a Softail standard anymore. I think they just call it a Softail standard now because it's the lowest or base Softail now, but really there's nothing about the modern day Softail standard that you can really trace back to its original roots, which again I think is a little bit disrespectful to the original FXST and disrespectful to Harley-Davidson's lineage. If you're gonna use that name, you gotta have some of the core elements of the bike that started it all. But even with the modern day Softail standard, I still think the Softail standard in its entirety, especially the bike of the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s, the OG, the bike that started it all, sold a ton of these bikes over the years. The FXST and the FXSTC are definitely in my top 10 of best Softails of all time. Alright guys, so we're getting to the good stuff now. So number 5 on my all-time best Softails list has got to be the Softail Deluxe, the FLSTN. And I like this bike for a lot of different reasons. It ran for a really long time. Technically, the Deluxe didn't come out until 2005 and it ran until 2020. I say technically because there was a bike that was also model designation FLSTN that was a Softail Heritage Nostalgia. That bike came out in 1993. And that was a very exclusive special edition FLSTN that a lot of people nicknamed the Cow Glide, or more commonly they nicknamed the Moo Glide. The Moo Glide is a thing of legacy and lore within the Harley-Davidson world, which is one more really cool tidbit of information why I love the Deluxe. So the Moo Glide was, like I said, a 1993 Heritage Softail Nostalgia, which was a special limited edition Harley-Davidson that they came out with, and they only made about 2,500 of them. This is probably one of the most collectible bikes out there. Harley-Davidson promised that they wouldn't do it again. It was a one-time run only. Had a cowhide seat. You could get accessories for this bike like cowhide accents on saddlebags and windshield bags and things like that. Milwaukee is kind of known for their dairy farms, and so they had plenty of cowhides to go around for everybody, but they didn't make the bike again. But because it was so popular and Harley-Davidson couldn't help themselves, they did come out with a Heritage Softail special the next few years that was also technically like a nostalgia. I believe it was also an FLSTN if I'm not mistaken, and that ran for a couple years, but it wasn't technically the Moo Glide. They had to change it a little bit so that people wouldn't get upset. But then fast forward to 2005, that's when Harley-Davidson officially came out with the Softail Deluxe, and that's basically the bike that we had for a long time. No saddlebags. You do have the 3 headlights in the front. It was kind of like a stripped down Heritage, more or less. Very classic appeal, very like 50s-esque. In the latter years, you had the Tombstone taillight, which was really iconic on this bike. In Southern California, we could not keep these things on the floor. Back when they first came out, 2005, all the way up to about 2010 or 11, it was probably one of our best-selling bikes. Everybody wanted a Deluxe. It was just a good all-around bike that just appealed to the masses on so many different levels. The Chicano guys were using it as their preferred platform to build their Vikla-style motorcycles. You had a lot of guys that just loved the ultra-classic styling on these things with the big fenders, the beautiful headlamps, the laced wheels, white wall tires. It's just a really good overall looking motorcycle. So the Deluxe, the FLSTN, I also include the Softail Heritage Nostalgias, especially the 1993 Moo Glide. I kind of clump these all together, but really my number 5 on the all-time best Softails of all time goes to the Softail Deluxe. Alright guys, so let's take a look at what I feel like is the 4th best Softail of all time, and that is the Softail Night Train. So the Night Train, just looking at it, it's basically an FXST Softail standard that's been completely blacked out from head to toe. This bike first debuted in 1998, which was the last year of the Evo motor, so you could get the Night Train for 1 year with the Evo motor, and Harley-Davidson just kind of dipped its toe into this all blacked out cosmetic look because they weren't really sure how their riders were going to take to it, but the reception was very positive, and so Harley-Davidson, even though the first year or two they produced a very limited quantity, they soon ramped up production pretty aggressively because a lot of people wanted the Softail Night Train. So you had the wider rear tire like a Softail standard, 21-inch lace wheel in the front, and at first you had a lot of blacked out parts on the Night Train, but as time went on and we got into like 2007, 8, and 9, which I I think are the best years of the Softail night train. They were completely wrinkle blacking out the entire motor, including the heads, things like the fender struts, the engine casings were all that wrinkle black, and then black paint, of course, and the badge on the tank of the night train was always pretty sick. Bobbed rear fender, of course, usually had like a mini ape hanger on there as well. 5 3/4 headlight on there. And the blacked out nature of the night train, I usually accredit this bike for one of the pioneers in blacking out bikes. Around 2006, 2007, when the Street Bob came out, Harley-Davidson had a big movement called the Dark Custom movement, where bikes like the 48 and the Crossbones were coming out, and they kind of grouped them all together as their Dark Custom bikes. But the night train was way before its time. This was pretty much the pioneer in the motorcycle industry to completely black out bikes that were traditionally like chrome or aluminum, different colors of paint and finishes and everything. And so this is one instance when Harley-Davidson took a chance on something radical and new that paid off in a big way. So this bike ran for the entire length of the Twin Cam 88, and then in 2007 when Harley-Davidson launched the Twin Cam 96 with the 7-speed transmission, this bike got that. So 7, 8, and 9, when the bike was finally discontinued, those in my opinion were the best years. But the Softail night train during all its years of production was definitely a very, very popular bike that always sold very well. People still look for them today, and so it's a very highly sought after bike as well. It was a pioneer in the all blacked out look, and so for those reasons, the Softail night train, the FXSTB, is my number 4 on the all-time best Softails list. Alright guys, so the time has finally come. We are at the top 3 Softails of all time. So number 3, I'm going to have to give it to the Springer Softail, and I'm going to double it up here, guys. I'm going to lump both of the Springers together. So the Heritage Softail Springer as well. So the Springer Softail is the FXSTS, and the Softail Heritage Springer is the FLSTS. So guys, I'm just going to go ahead and just get right to the chase. The Springer is absolutely iconic in the Harley-Davidson world. There's nothing more nostalgic that you can throw on a Harley-Davidson, and for a frame that basically is everything is based on nostalgia, what more could you ask for than a part like a Springer front end? So Harley-Davidson brought the Springer out in 1988 as a way of bringing back that classic style of the 40s and earlier. Of course, Harley-Davidson, when they launched the Hydroglide in 1949, they pretty much did away with the Springer at that point, but Harley-Davidson utilized its best play in its playbook, and they brought back a classic style, and of course they re-engineered it to make it handle better and just perform in a better manner. So the Softail Springer in one form or another ran from 1988 all the way up to 2007, and then in 2008 they came out with the Crossbones, which was a blacked out version of a Springer. The Crossbones ran for I want to say 3 or 4 years, and then I believe it was discontinued in 2011. So you had a Springer available in the Harley-Davidson lineup in one form or another from 1988 all the way till about 2010. Now personally, I do like the Crossbones, but for a Springer bike, you gotta go chrome in my opinion. I feel like as soon as Harley-Davidson stepped away from the chrome in 2008 when they went to the Crossbones, that's when the popularity of the Springer started to wane a little bit. The guys that the blacked out dark custom look appealed to were the younger crowd that weren't really into the Springers, plus the price point for that bike was kind of high for the time, like $17,000, $18,000, and so that bike was kind of a little bit of a miss. But honestly guys, the fact that Harley-Davidson hasn't had a Springer front end for the last like 14 years is one of the biggest mistakes the motor company has ever made. They are leaving so much money on the table right now by not having a Springer. I have been begging on my knees to anyone that will listen to please, I'm begging you, bring back a Springer. And you know, I've heard things like, okay, Harley-Davidson wasn't able to make it perform to today's standards. They weren't able to incorporate ABS brakes, you know, blah, blah, blah. I've heard all the excuses in the book. Harley-Davidson needs to re-engineer a new Springer front end that meets all the legal DOT requirements and all that BS, because Springers go for top dollar right now. If we can get a Springer on the showroom, it's like the holy grail. Me personally, I like the FL front end better. That's the fatter, wider tire that is usually the Softail Heritage Springer with like the bags and the windshield and stuff. You know, the skinnier front end is the FXSTS, which has the narrower wheel in the front. In 1997, that's when they first launched the Heritage Softail Springer, and my gosh, that's a beautiful bike. Wrap it up, guys. Top 3 easy. My top 3 bikes actually could be interchangeable. I had a really hard time with my top 3 motorcycles, but I think this is a solid number 3. The Softail Springer is just an icon in the Harley-Davidson's world. It's foolish that Harley-Davidson has stepped away from it for so long. In my opinion, there's not a more beautiful Harley-Davidson in the world than a Heritage Softail Springer. The popularity is crazy right now. The values still remain extremely strong. The fact that Harley-Davidson brought back an obsolete technology in 1988 to give it an iconic look that paired perfectly with the Softail chassis, that look of the hardtail, in my opinion, was just a match made in heaven. And maybe because Harley-Davidson ran it for so long on so many models, it diluted the market a little bit in terms of demand. But bring it back. Please bring it back. Alright guys, so welcome to number 2 best Softail of all time. So for number 2, and you guys knew this bike was coming, I gotta give it to the Fat Boy. So in 1990, Harley-Davidson decided to roll out the Fat Boy, and I don't really know how the negotiations went with James Cameron and the movie production studio for Terminator 2, but somehow they were able to create probably one of the most epic bar scenes of all time in Hollywood history. And so the bike was already extremely good, and then you had at the time probably the biggest star in Hollywood ride away on it after he just stole someone's clothes, their boots, and their motorcycle, and playing like Bad to the Bone or something like that. I mean, it just completely catapulted the Fat Boy into what I think is probably the most recognizable, the most iconic motorcycle Harley-Davidson has ever created, and I don't say that lightly. I really do think that. If you were to ask anybody in the world, including people that don't even ride motorcycles, to name one model of Harley-Davidson, they're probably gonna say the Fat Boy. So the Fat Boy, like I said, they started making it in 1990. They have made it continuously till the present day, and so it has never stopped, no breaks. They have added additional models, like they had the Fat Boy Low that came out, I want to say like 2010 or 11 or something like that. And then they came out with the Fat Boy S, which I think was a 2016 model year launch. In 2020, they had the 30th year anniversary Fat Boy, which is a really cool collectible numbered bike. Then in 2018, when they redesigned the Fat Boy, they went all in on just the fat, muscular look. I love the redesigned Fat Boy. They widened the rear tire. It was a 200 millimeter rear tire, and they beefed it up to a full 240 millimeters right there with the Breakout, and really the fattest rear tire that the Harley-Davidson factory offers. Everything from the freight train nacelle on the Fat Boy. I love the new like squared off headlamp on the bike now. You have kind of the controversial lore behind the Fat Boy and the way it was named and designed. The lore is that the name Fat Boy was derived from the two names of the atomic bombs that were dropped in World War II, Fat Man and Little Boy. You combine one word from both of those bombs and you got Fat Boy. People will also argue that things like the highlights around the motor are modeled after the atomic bomb. You've got the wings on the tank with the star badge on the tank. It's definitely a military tribute bike, probably Air Force. Whether that's just a coincidence or not, I don't think it's a coincidence. I just think that now you don't talk about how it got its name because it's not politically correct and it's insensitive, which I get it. You have that Harley-Davidson lore where no one can really confirm or deny that that is the case. The Fat Boy in just every sense is just the quintessential Harley-Davidson. The styling is mean and rugged. You got these solid wheels with the bullet holes in them. Of course, they've gone away from that style a little bit, but the fat tank, the fat wheel, the fat fenders, the big headlights, simplistic look. The Fat Boy is just one of the most recognizable, iconic motorcycles of all time. And so for me, it's just an easy no-brainer that this is number 2 in the greatest Softails of all time. Alright guys, so the time has come. Before I get to the best Softail of all time, I'm actually going to talk about the worst Softail of all time. And I know some of you guys look forward to the bad ones more than you look forward to the good ones. So for the very worst Softail of all time, I got to give it to the FXDR. Now, It saddens me to say this because the FXDR had a lot of really cool things about it. The FXDR came out in the 2019 model year, and so it was first launched on the latest version of the Softail chassis. And it pains me because it was kind of a cool bike that Harley-Davidson, I think, probably spent a lot of time and effort and money in developing a lot of bespoke parts that were unique to this bike. The FXDR was kind of like a drag-inspired, long, lean, low, fat tire, a little bit of a rake in the front end type of a bike. You had a bunch of weight savings attributes and parts about it. You had forged wheels. You had this unique aluminum swing arm. You had a unique tank on there. You had really unique body pieces like rear fender, tank like I mentioned, front fender. You had this really unique exhaust system that isn't shared with any other bike. It was actually a pretty good performing bike, but unfortunately the fact of the matter is nobody asked for it. Nobody wanted this bike. I don't know if they had a designer in the closet somewhere that wasn't talking to anybody and just designing a bike by himself for a year and never really put it through any type of focus groups or asked anybody if they liked it or asked any of the dealerships if they liked it. I'm not sure if that happened or not, but when it launched, a lot of people were interested in it. It was actually the launch video of this bike was one of my most watched videos ever, like 1.4 million views or something like that. But the problem is nobody bought it. I want to say the first year it was out in 2019, we may have sold like 3, maybe. It was just such a huge flop. And it was sad, but I've never seen a bike flop so hard, probably since I've been doing this. Maybe the Street 500 and Street 750, those were real turds. But Harley-Davidson decided to try it one more year. In 2020, they came out with the FXDR again for a second year. Nothing really changed there, same deal. I think they lowered the price actually down a little bit to see if they could do something with it. And the second year, I think I maybe sold like 2 or something like that at our dealership. And maybe it was more popular in other parts of the world, I don't know. Again, it's sad because it was kind of a cool bike with a lot of cool features on it. But unfortunately, it was just completely out of touch with the market at the time. Anyways, I digress, guys. The FXDR didn't sell. Nobody liked it. Nobody wanted it. Nobody asked for it. And it was only around for 2 years, and Harley-Davidson dumped it and probably had the worst ROI of all time on it. You've made it, guys. You have made it to the #1 Softail of all time. Congratulations. I think for those of you who are big-time Harley-Davidson enthusiasts, you've probably already guessed the bike by now. So the #1 Softail of all time is none other than the Heritage Softail. So the Heritage Softail first debuted in 1986, so just 2 years after the original Softail, the FXST. Now guys, the Softail Heritage is just something of legacy, and it's just one of those bikes that is synonymous with Harley-Davidson. If I'm not mistaken, it has been in constant production since 1986. The Heritage Softail first came out, and then somewhere along the line they came out with the FLSTC, which is the Heritage Softail Classic. You basically add a little bit more chrome and nice finishes and things like that for the Classic. But the Softail Heritage and the Softail Heritage Classic basically once again retraced its roots back to the 1949 Hydroglide. This bike takes styling cues and inspiration from the Hydroglide. Big FL hydraulic front forks. You got a lot of the frills and things like that of the day, like frilly leather on the saddlebags and on the seat trim. The Heritage Softail absolutely dominated sales in the 80s and the 90s. It's interesting because I talked to my dad, Jerry, who was selling on the floor at that time, and you talk about like the FXR to him, and he said, yeah, the FXR sales were like okay, they were kind of mediocre, they weren't that great. But the bike that really did business was the Softail Heritage. Everybody was about that bike. For a lot of different reasons. I think it was very in touch with the style at the time. A lot of guys wanted that bike because it looked just like a classic Harley-Davidson. You had the bag so you could put your stuff in there. It was kind of like the original bagger, guys, quite frankly. And I know you don't use that term unless it's on a touring chassis bike. And the guys that were buying bikes back then that have a similar use case to the guys today that are buying street glides, those guys were buying Heritage Softails back in the day. It's just kind of a well-rounded bike. You had the windshield up front, you had good lighting, you had the real comfortable comfortable seat and suspension. The Heritage was just kind of like the Swiss Army knife do everything bike, and it still is to a certain extent. I just feel like now with the Heritage, sales have kind of dwindled, and in my opinion, that's because the style is no longer something that people are looking for. And it's interesting too, we talk about this style and the Heritage getting inspiration from the Hydroglide. This year we have the Icons Collection Hydroglide, and it's built on none other than the Heritage platform. So we've kind of come full circle now. Now the retro throwback reincarnation of the Hydroglide is built on none other than the Softail Heritage platform. But then we have other versions of it, like I mentioned earlier, the FLSTS, the Heritage Softail Springer. I would argue that the Deluxe is a close cousin of the Heritage Softail as well, just because, like I mentioned, the Softail Heritage Nostalgia had Heritage Softail on the fender still, I believe. And so the Heritage is the king. It's the king of the Softail family. And by today's standards, like I mentioned, they're not the best seller on the floor. They're still there though. They're still a great bike. We actually modify them now and kind of make our own Deluxe, where we take the bags off and put high bars on them and everything. There's a lot that can be done with them. They're a really good, well-rounded motorcycle that kind of has one of those timeless Harley-Davidson styles to them. And so that's it, guys. The Heritage is king. Number one, best Softail of all time. Let me know if you guys agree with my list. Let me know if you guys hate me for some of the things I've said on this video. Let me know if I nailed it. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. As always, if you're looking for a Harley-Davidson in Southern California, make sure you hit us up here at Laidlaw's Harley-Davidson. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you hit that subscribe button, give me a like, thumbs up, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. Take care. Later.